Martin Anders had been driving bus number 12 through the bustling streets of Rivertown for nearly 15 years. He had become a familiar face to the city's residents, greeting morning commuters, tired students, and cheerful seniors with a warm smile and a steady, reliable presence. His day began like any other: a cold cup of coffee on the dashboard, a glance at the route schedule, and the hum of the engine that had become as comforting as the rhythm of his own heartbeat. On this particular Thursday, the autumn leaves swirled through the streets as a brisk wind hinted at the coming winter. Martin adjusted the rearview mirror, glancing at the handful of passengers quietly immersed in their own lives. A mother juggled her toddler and groceries. A teenager in a worn hoodie scrolled endlessly on his phone, and an elderly man gazed out the window, lost in thought. As the bus rolled to a stop near Riverview Park, Martin noticed a small figure sitting on a bench near the curb. A girl, no older than 7, clutched a bright pink backpack and looked around nervously. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Martin frowned, glancing at the street to see if a parent or guardian was nearby. When no one appeared, he opened the door and called out gently, "Hey there, are you getting on?" The little girl hesitated, biting her lip, before climbing the steps. Her backpack looked almost too big for her, and her tiny hands clutched its straps as though they were a lifeline. "Where to, sweetheart?" Martin asked, trying to sound cheerful. I don't know," she said softly, her voice trembling. Her brown eyes filled with fresh tears, and she wiped them away with her sleeve. Martin's heart ached at the sight. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and kind. "Are you lost?" The girl nodded, barely able to speak. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily," she whispered. "All right, Emily. Do you remember your address or your parents' phone number?" She shook her head, her lower lip quivering. Martin glanced at the few passengers, who were now watching with quiet concern. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, thinking quickly. Leaving her alone wasn't an option, and calling the police felt too drastic, at least for now. "Let's tell you what," he said, kneeling slightly to meet her eye level. "Why don't you ride with me for a bit? We'll figure this out together, okay?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. Martin gave her a reassuring smile and handed her a tissue from his jacket pocket. As he resumed the route, Martin kept an eye on Emily through the mirror. She sat near the front, clutching her backpack like a shield, her small feet swinging above the floor. The passengers were unusually quiet, the usual chatter replaced by murmured sympathy and stolen glances. At the next stop, an elderly woman named Doris, who rode Martin's bus almost daily, approached him. "That poor child," she said softly. "Do you think you can find her home?" "I'll try," Martin replied. "She's too scared to tell me much yet, but I'll do what I can." Doris nodded, her wrinkled face creased with worry. "You're a good man, Martin. Let me know if I can help." As the bus continued its route, Martin began asking Emily gentle questions, hoping to jog her memory. "Do you remember what your house looks like?" he asked. "There's a tree in front," she said quietly. "A big tree with yellow leaves." "Okay, that's a start," Martin said. "Do you remember anything else? Maybe the name of your street or a store near your house?" Emily frowned, deep in thought, but shook her head. The minutes stretched into an hour, and Martin's concern grew. He couldn't shake the image of her tear-streaked face or the fear in her eyes. He decided to make a detour, announcing to the remaining passengers that he'd be taking a short break to help the girl. Most nodded in understanding, offering words of encouragement. Martin pulled the bus into a small parking lot near a diner he frequented. He turned to Emily. "How about we take a little break? We can grab something to eat, and maybe you'll remember more when you're feeling better." Emily nodded, and Martin led her into the diner. The waitress, a kind woman named Carol, immediately noticed Emily's distressed state. "Everything all right, Martin?" she asked. "Not quite," Martin said, explaining the situation. "We're trying to figure out where she lives. Carol knelt down, her voice soothing. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Carol. Would you like some pancakes?" Emily nodded shyly, and Carol brought her a plate of warm, fluffy pancakes topped with whipped cream and strawberries. As Emily ate, her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she began to talk more. She mentioned a playground near her house and a man who always walked his dog nearby. Martin listened carefully, piecing together the clues. After their meal, Martin thanked Carol and returned to the bus with Emily. He decided to drive through nearby neighborhoods, looking for anything that matched her descriptions. Hours passed, and the sky began to darken. Martin's determination never wavered, even as fatigue set in. He promised himself he wouldn't stop until Emily was safely home. Finally, as they turned onto a quiet street lined with trees, Emily's eyes lit up. "That's it," she cried, pointing to a house with a large yellow-leafed tree in the front yard. Martin's heart swelled with relief. He parked the bus and walked Emily to the door, where her frantic parents opened it. Tears of joy streamed down their faces as they embraced their daughter. "You found her," Emily's mother sobbed, clutching Martin's hands. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Martin waved off their gratitude with a humble smile. "I'm just glad she's safe." As he turned to leave, Emily's father stopped him. "Please, stay for a moment. We'd like to thank you properly." Martin hesitated but nodded, curious about what they had in mind. Emily's parents, Mark and Julia, invited Martin into their warm and inviting home. The living room was adorned with family photos, children's artwork on the walls, and a cozy fireplace that crackled softly in the background. The air smelled of cinnamon, likely from a candle burning on the coffee table. Emily sat nestled between her parents, her pink backpack still clutched in her small hands, though she looked much calmer now. "Please, sit," Mark said, motioning to a plush armchair. "We owe you so much. I can't even imagine what would have happened if you hadn't found her." "I was just doing what anyone would," Martin replied, taking the offered seat. "She's a brave little girl. I just helped her along the way." Julia wiped her tears with a tissue and smiled warmly. "Still, you went out of your way for her. That kind of kindness isn't something we'll ever forget." Martin smiled modestly, feeling a touch of embarrassment at the praise. "I'm just glad she's safe and back home where she belongs." Emily's father leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "We'd like to thank you properly. Please, let us do something for you." Martin shook his head. "There's no need for that. Seeing her back with her family is thanks enough for me." But Mark and Julia exchanged a determined glance. Julia stood and disappeared into another room, returning with a small envelope in her hands. "At least take this," she said, extending it toward him. Martin raised his palms. "Oh no, I couldn't accept." "Please," Mark interjected firmly, but with gratitude in his tone. "It's just a small token. You went above and beyond today, and it means the world to us. At least allow us to show our appreciation." Seeing the earnestness in their eyes, Martin reluctantly accepted the envelope. He tucked it into his jacket pocket without opening it, intending to donate whatever was inside to a local charity. Before he could stand to leave, Julia spoke again. "Actually, there's something else." Her voice trembled slightly, as if she were unsure how to proceed. "If it's not too much trouble, we'd like to hear a bit about you. You brought Emily home, and yet we don't even know anything about the man who gave her such care." Martin hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially with strangers, but their curiosity seemed genuine. "Not much to tell," he said with a shrug. "I've been driving buses for 15 years. Grew up here in Rivertown, live in a little apartment downtown. No kids of my own, but I've got a niece and nephew who keep me busy on the weekends." Mark smiled. "You seem like the kind of man who's always looking out for others." "Maybe," Martin said, chuckling softly. "Or maybe I'm just in the right place at the right time." Emily piped up for the first time since arriving home. He's nice. He gave me tissues and pancakes. Her small voice carried a weight of trust and warmth that made everyone in the room smile. After a few more minutes of heartfelt conversation, Martin stood to leave, promising himself he wouldn't let his bus schedule fall too far behind the next day. As he stepped toward the door, Emily ran after him, her tiny arms wrapping around his waist. "Thank you, Mr. Martin," she said, looking up at him with shining eyes. "You're very welcome," Emily Martin replied, patting her head gently. That evening, as Martin returned to his modest apartment, he pulled the envelope from his pocket. He expected to find a few bills tucked inside, but when he opened it, he found something else entirely, a handwritten note. "Dear Mr. Anders, you may see yourself as just a bus driver, but to us you are a hero. Your kindness brought our family back together today. We will never forget what you've done. Please let us know if there's anything we can ever do for you. With deepest gratitude. Mark, Julia, and Emily." Enclosed with the note was a card for a family-owned construction company, Mark's business, and a small certificate for free maintenance and repairs for life. Martin stared at the items, deeply touched by the gesture. He didn't know when or if he'd ever need their services, but their thoughtfulness made him smile. The next morning, Martin resumed his usual route, his life seemingly back to normal. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something about yesterday's events had left a mark on him. As he greeted passengers and navigated through Rivertown's bustling streets, he found himself paying closer attention to the people around him, the worried expressions, the quiet smiles, the hurried glances at phones. By mid-afternoon, his route took him through a quiet residential area, and as he stopped to let an elderly passenger off, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Martin." He turned to see Emily and Julia standing near the curb, waving. He waved back, his grin widening as Emily ran up to the bus. "We were hoping to see you," Julia said, smiling warmly. "Emily wanted to give you something." From behind her back, Emily produced a small drawing. It depicted a bus with smiling passengers inside, and a figure at the front with a name tag reading Martin above it. In large wobbly letters were the words "Thank you." Martin's throat tightened as he accepted the drawing. "This is wonderful, Emily. Thank you. I'll keep it with me always." "You're welcome," she said, beaming. As the bus pulled away, Martin tucked the drawing into the dashboard, where it stayed as a constant reminder of the little girl who had reminded him how much a single act of kindness could mean. The week following his encounter with Emily and her family had been tough for Martin. His decision to take extra time that day to help Emily had meant cutting his route short, which hadn't sat well with his supervisor. While his boss eventually let the issue slide, it added to Martin's growing sense of unease. Work had been sparse lately due to seasonal schedule changes, and Martin had been feeling the pinch. As if that weren't enough, his old sedan, a vehicle he'd lovingly nicknamed Betsy, broke down completely the day after his encounter with Emily. It had been unreliable for months, but now it refused to start no matter how hard Martin coaxed it. With his meager savings, he couldn't afford the repairs, let alone a replacement. For days, he relied on public transit to get to work, but it added hours to his already long days. One evening, sitting in his tiny apartment, Martin looked at the certificate Mark and Julia had given him. It was tucked inside the envelope along with their handwritten note. He had initially dismissed the idea of using it, not wanting to burden them further, but as he stared at it now, the words "free maintenance and repairs for life" practically glowed on the page. After much deliberation, Martin finally picked up the phone and dialed the number printed on the card. "Rivertown Home and Auto Repairs," a friendly voice answered. "This is Mark speaking. How can I help?" "Hi, Mark," Martin said, clearing his throat. "It's Martin Anders. I drove Emily home that day, remember?" Mark's voice lit up. "Of course I remember. How are you?" "I'm doing all right," Martin said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Listen, I hate to call and ask for anything, but I've run into a bit of trouble with my car. It's completely out of commission, and I wasn't sure if. He trailed off, feeling awkward. Say no more, Mark interrupted. You've got that certificate, right? It's good for exactly this kind of thing. What's wrong with the car? Won't start, Martin admitted. I think the engine might be shot. All right, Mark said confidently. We'll take care of it. Bring it by the shop tomorrow. If it's not drivable, I'll have one of my guys tow it for you. No charge. Martin exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it. The next morning, a tow truck arrived outside Martin's apartment, and the driver greeted him with a friendly wave. Mark sent me, the man said as he hooked up Martin's car. He told me to tell you not to worry about a thing. Martin followed the truck on foot to the shop, where Mark and a few mechanics were already waiting. Mark greeted him with a firm handshake and a smile. We'll get Betsy back on the road, he said, glancing at the worn sedan. I don't know how to thank you, Martin said sincerely. You already did, Mark replied, patting Martin on the shoulder. You brought Emily home. That's all the thanks we'll ever need. The mechanics dove into the repairs, and while Martin waited, Mark invited him into the office for coffee. They sat across from each other in the small, cozy space, and for the first time, Martin shared more about his struggles. I've been driving buses for years, Martin said. It's steady work most of the time, but lately it's been harder to make ends meet. And with the car breaking down, well, let's just say it hasn't been the easiest week. Mark listened intently, his expression thoughtful. I get it, he said. Running this shop wasn't always easy either. There were times we barely scraped by, but when things get tough, you learn who you can count on. And Martin, you've already proven yourself to be someone people can count on. Martin smiled faintly, grateful for the understanding. By the end of the day, the mechanics had finished their work. Betsy was not only running again but sounded better than she had in years. When Martin asked about the bill, Mark shook his head. Not a penny, Mark said firmly. It's on us. Martin was overwhelmed. I don't know how to thank you. You already did, Mark repeated with a grin. But there's one more thing I want to talk to you about. Martin raised an eyebrow, curious. My crew and I were talking while we worked on your car, Mark said. And we think you deserve more than just repairs. You deserve something reliable. If you're interested, we'd like to offer you a vehicle upgrade, something from our pre-owned inventory. No strings attached. Martin's jaw dropped. An upgrade? Mark, I couldn't possibly. Yes, you can, Mark said, cutting him off. It's not just from us. After we told a few people in the community what you did for Emily, donations started coming in. People wanted to help, and this is what we came up with. Speechless, Martin could only nod as Mark led him to the lot. Parked in the corner was a shiny blue pickup truck, modest but sturdy. This one's yours, Mark said, tossing him the keys. Martin stared at the truck, his emotions swirling. He had started the day worried about making ends meet, and now he had a reliable vehicle and a renewed sense of hope, all thanks to a family and a community that had rallied behind him. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he glanced over at Mark, who stood smiling beside the truck. Thank you, Martin said, his voice thick with gratitude. This means more to me than you'll ever know. Mark waved him off with a grin. Just keep doing what you're doing, Martin. The world needs more people like you. As Martin settled back into his routine over the following weeks, life returned to its usual rhythm, though the events with Emily and her family lingered warmly in his mind. His new truck made his days easier, and the small acts of kindness he had always shared with his passengers seemed to carry even greater meaning. The drawing Emily had given him remained on his dashboard, a quiet but powerful reminder of how one choice could change lives. One crisp Saturday morning, Martin's bus route took him past Riverview Park, the place where he had first met Emily. The yellow-leafed trees stood bare now, their branches stretching toward a pale winter sky. As he pulled to a stop near the park, he noticed a small group gathered on the curb. There, waving eagerly, was Emily. flanked by Mark and Julia. Martin's heart leaped with surprise as he opened the bus doors. "What brings you all out here today?" he asked, stepping down to greet them. Emily handed him a folded piece of paper with a shy smile. "We wanted to invite you," she said. Martin opened the paper to find a handmade card with colorful drawings of houses, trees, and smiling faces. Inside was a simple message: "Thank you for finding me, Mr. Martin. We're having a neighborhood celebration today, and we hope you'll come." Mark stepped forward, his grin wide. "It's a little block party we're hosting to say thank you to the people who make Rivertown special. And Martin, that includes you." Martin hesitated, glancing at the passengers on the bus. "I'd love to, but I'm on duty." Julia interrupted gently. "We spoke to your supervisor. You're covered for the afternoon." Her warm smile reassured him. "Come on, let us do this for you." For once, Martin allowed himself to set aside his work and join in. He parked the bus safely nearby and followed the family to their street, where the party was in full swing. Neighbors mingled, children played, and tables overflowed with food and drinks. People greeted Martin as if they'd known him for years, many of them recognizing him as the friendly bus driver who had been a constant in their lives. Mark called for everyone's attention, clinking a glass to quiet the crowd. "Today we're celebrating the people who make Rivertown feel like home," he said. "And we want to give special thanks to a man who reminded us what community really means." He gestured toward Martin. "Martin Anders, you're more than just a bus driver. You're a friend, a neighbor, and a true example of kindness. This is our way of saying thank you." The crowd erupted in applause, and Martin, though unaccustomed to being in the spotlight, smiled humbly. As he looked around at the faces of those he had quietly served over the years, he felt a deep sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing. Emily ran up to him, holding another drawing. This one showed a heart in the center of a bus, surrounded by smiling faces. "This is for you," she said, "because you make people happy." Martin knelt to accept the drawing, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Emily. This means the world to me." As the day wore on, Martin found himself laughing, sharing stories, and feeling a warmth that stayed with him long after the celebration ended. That evening, as he drove his new truck home, he thought about how much his life had changed in such a short time. Not because of grand gestures or dramatic turns of fate, but because of simple, heartfelt moments of connection. From that day forward, Martin carried the spirit of the celebration with him. Every smile he gave, every kind word he shared, felt like part of something larger, an invisible thread binding him to the community he loved. And on the dashboard of his bus, Emily's drawing stayed, a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes.